Welcome to the Political Psychology Laboratories Research Talk. We host this a few times every year, whenever we feel like it. And we have two very special guests today, Dr. Mark Brandt from Michigan State University and Dr. Winda Justicia from University of Indonesia, but she just finished her PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. Yay! Thank you. And today's theme is ideological differences in partisan views and belief superiority, insights from the US and Indonesia. And this topic is like really special this season because it's election season for both the US and Indonesia. We just finished like our presidential elections, which is like, controversial just like every other election. And the US is also about to have their election very soon. So this topic is like really important right now. Elections can like make people behave in a certain way depending on like the social and like political climate of that given culture of that or that given country. So today we're going to have perspectives from both Indonesia and the United States on how these kind of social phenomenons can affect people's behavior. And right, so let's just get on with it. Dr. Brandt, you can start.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, that's awesome. There we go. All right. Thank you, everyone. So I'm Mark Brandt. I think I've met maybe everybody in the room, but maybe not everybody on the online room. So thanks for coming. And thanks for the Political Psych Lab for hosting me this week and next week too. You can't get rid of me just yet. And so I've appreciated my time here. Looking forward to what we do next. Today I'm going to be talking about this project on ideological differences in party cues, which is a project that we've, I think, finished, I hope, that we have finished collecting data for. And this is with Eamon Trickey, who is a student in my lab. He's a bachelor student. He'll graduate actually in a few months and have his bachelor's degree, but he was excited to get involved in research, and we found this project and he really took off with it. And so it's been a fun project for that reason. So as a political psychologist, sometimes we look at these people who are engaged in politics. These are Americans engaged in politics. And one of the things we do is we're like, what's their deal? Why are they like this? Why are they acting like this? And one of the things that we sometimes look at is, why do people with these different political beliefs, why is it that they differ from each other? Why do they hold those different beliefs? And given that they hold these different beliefs, do they differ in other ways? So just as a reminder, political ideology, at least how I'll talk about it today, is heavily influenced kind of by the American Western Europe version of political ideology. But we think about it as a continuum, more or less, that ranges from left-wing, or in America we'll call this liberal or progressive, system challenging side of things, to a more right-wing, conservative, more resistant to change, system justifying side of things. And today I'm going to actually be mostly talking about people and their own ideological beliefs, just normal everyday citizens. But we can think about how different political parties map onto this space. So in the US, we'd have the Democrats being kind of the center-left party, and the Republicans being a right-wing party. We can do this in other countries. Go north of the American border, go to Canada. They have some maple leaves in their logos of their political parties, represent their country. But this is the NDP, this is their Social Democratic Party. And then they have this party helpfully called the Conservative Party. They're more conservative. And in the middle, they have a party they call the Liberal Party. Or you can go to Europe, and we can go to Germany. They have this party here called Die Linke, which translates directly to the left. So again, super convenient on where to place them. And they also have these parties here, the NDP or the AfD, which are basically the descendants of the Nazis. They're right wing. And in the middle, they have what is like a socialist-ish party and the Christian Democrats. Now, I know this particular version of ideology doesn't actually translate perfectly all around the world, but a lot of countries have something that looks a little bit like this. They might label things differently, and they might have a different historical context to it, but they kind of have this idea. So social psychologists and political psychologists have then said, okay, what explains why people are on these different sides of the political issues? And we've been arguing about this since 1955, which is 5 years before my parents were born. And one of the things that we've argued about over this time is whether or not people with different ideological beliefs, if they have kind of fundamentally different psychological processes and experiences, or if they are kind of more similar, have similar psychological processes, although differing in their values and in their attitudes. And this is something that's continued on from 1950. There's a big resurgence in the 1980s, and then again in the early 2000s, and then again in the 2020s. There's multiple perspectives on this. I'm going to mention two, and actually the next talk will mention another one that I'm just going to pretend doesn't exist for the sake of this talk. But one is this ideological asymmetry idea, and this is the idea that people on the left and the right, they differ from one another because the different ideologies are attractive to people with different psychological profiles. And because of this, people on the left and the right end up having different psychological processes in which they interpret political information. So the idea here, apologies for my messed up graphics, but is that conservatives or rightists, they tend to be more rigid, they process things more rigidly, they're less deliberative thinkers, they're more trusting of group leaders, and because of these differences, they have differences in political reasoning and behavior. So it is these psychological differences that lead to a particular type of ideology, which leads to a particular differences in reasoning. The other perspective that we'll talk about today is this ideological symmetry perspective. This perspective doesn't deny that there's differences between ideological groups, but the idea is that actually they probably have pretty similar psychological processes despite differing in their attitudes and values. There's not like one core theory in this group, this kind of perspective, but in general, it's like the reasoning is pretty simple. It's that people on the left and the right are people. And so because of that, they'll have similar psychological processes. So there's kind of two different ways to look at these questions. So one is, do people with different ideologies differ? And the answer is yep, definitely. They have different attitudes, they vote for different people, this sort of stuff. But then also, do people with different ideologies have different psychological processes? Are they processing information or emotions differently? And that's harder to say. And so this is what we're looking at today. So are there ideological differences in the effects of party cues? That's the idea today. I'll describe what party cues are here now. Okay. So this is a political policy, whether or not we should have higher vehicles emission standards. So this would help the environment. That's kind of the idea. Regulates the amount of pollution that can come out of the back of your car. This is just a policy. If we add in information or cues that link a party to its policy stance, that's a party cue. So here, if we learn that Democratic leaders support higher vehicle emission standards, this would indicate, this would be the party cue, this additional information about what Democratic leaders do. And the finding in this literature, which is a long, large literature, is that people support policies linked to their party cue. So if you're an American and you support the Democratic Party, then this cue here would lead you to be more supportive of higher vehicle emission standards. So there's two different reasons why these people think this happens, although for my purposes today, it doesn't actually matter which reason it is. I just think it's useful to know how people are thinking about this. So one is that party cues are working as heuristics, so they're mental shortcuts. And in this case, when you think about a policy like this vehicle emissions, your thoughts are like, well, how does this help me? How does this help other people? How does this help people I care about? Is this going to make my life more complicated? Will this matter for the new car I bought? Or should I buy a motorcycle? What should I do? How is this going to benefit me or hurt me? And that's actually kind of complicated. Political policies are annoying like that. It would be really handy if they were simple, but actually the political policies are hard. And so people look for shortcuts. And if you have it attached to a political party that you trust, That's a shortcut. All of a sudden, oh, okay, people I trust, they support this, great. The other is that it's an identity motivation. And the idea here is that when you get a policy, one of the things you're considering is like, how do people like me think about this policy? How does my political group think about this policy? And this party queue gives you that information, and it shows you how you can be a good group member. If I'm motivated to be a good group member, I find out my party leader supports this policy, then as a good group member, I can support that policy. So when we look at these two perspectives on ideological differences, this asymmetry perspective that suggests that conservatives should be more rigid, less deliberative thinking, more trusting of group leaders, this should predict greater queue susceptibility, so more likely to use party queues because they're more likely to be trusting of those group leaders, so they should be more willing to follow them. But also, if you're a less deliberative thinker, having a shortcut is awesome. That's what you want. You live for shortcuts. And so then you should be more likely to follow the queue. The symmetry perspective would, of course, predict no differences. So there are some reasons why you might not predict this. So one is that there is evidence for ideological differences in deliberative thinking and rigidity, they're not super robust. It turns out that they're smaller in representative samples in the United States than convenience samples in the United States. So there seems to be something going on with the convenience samples. And they're also much smaller outside of the United States. And so it might be that this isn't something fundamental about ideology, but it's just like Americans being weird, essentially. It's also been found that liberals also trust, or leftists in the US, they also trust group leaders. It's just they have different group leaders. And so it's not that they never care about who their group leaders are, so they still might follow. So one major step in this area of research is this meta-analysis by Peter Ditto and his colleagues. There's a lot to this meta-analysis, but the key thing for today is that they had a meta-analysis of party queues. There's 27 studies, about 10,000 participants, and they found that liberals and conservatives have exactly the same size party queue effect. So you might think, great, they've answered your question. I can stop talking and we can learn about Indonesian politics. But because I'm a social scientist, we found things wrong with it. So one is that the issues in this Ditto meta-analysis are not representative of issues in American politics. And that matters here because the original studies were designed to test other stuff. And one possibility is that when they're designed to test those other things, the researchers were choosing issues that did not have ideological differences because this would mess up their other kind of topic they were studying. So as a way of controlling for that, they might have chosen issues without differences. It also could just be like if you're always choosing really, controversial issues, that might be a different thing than if you're not choosing less controversial issues or something. The meta-analysis, they don't have any measures of possible mechanisms for these ideological differences. So does rigidity even relate to partisan queue susceptibility? We actually don't really know. And they primarily use unrepresentative samples, so student samples and things like that. And they only use data from the United States, and they do this on purpose, I think, just because it's easier to categorize stuff ideologically. And so today we're gonna take care of those first three things, and we're not gonna take care of the US part. Still use data from the US primarily. And I highlight this even when I give this talk in the US. This is not just like me catering to an international crowd, but rather I think it's important also to do this outside the US, in part because the whole idea here is we're trying to figure out what is fundamental to these ideological beliefs. And if it flips around from country to country, it suggests it's not fundamental to the ideological belief. It might be important in a country, or might be one way in one country, but if it moves around, and it suggests it's not some property of left-wing or right-wing beliefs, but rather some other property or context that's influencing these things. So it's important to do this. It's just not what I'm doing today. I'm going to go into depth in this first one a little bit more. So issue sampling or topic sampling is this idea that is actually pretty straightforward once you kind of think about it, I think. And you can think about it by just applying what we know about population sampling. So when we're recruiting samples for our studies, we have this population of people that we're interested in, and we can't sample them all. You know, if we're going to have a representative sample of Indonesia, we only need to recruit, what, how many, 200 million people, something? So that's it.
250.
Yeah, just 250 million people, easy to do. I'm sure we can recruit everybody. No, that's very hard, almost impossible. So instead, we try to take representative samples. And if we do this well, then this sample here allows us to make inferences back to the population as a whole. However, if we take a sample of maybe only translucent people, then these kind of see-through people, then you don't get a sense, like you'll be wrong about the population on average. The same thing is true with issues. So in any political system, there's a lot of different issues. There's issues about agriculture, about pollution, about infrastructure, about weapons, about religion, about the police, about science, lots of different issues. But if we run studies and we choose if we run studies and we choose representative samples of issues, that's really helpful. We can make those inferences back to all issues. However, what we usually do, myself included for basically up until like last year, is we take one issue and then we can't say much about the whole population of issues. We can only say something about one issue. Now that, just to be clear, can be totally fine if you are interested in that one issue. So sometimes you're really interested in environmental issues, for example. That's fine. Then if you're just trying to make judgments and generalizations about the environment, how people think about environmental issues, you're good. You can just do that. But if your goal is to say something about issues generally, then it's more complicated. You have to think about how your issues map onto like the population of issues in your context. So today we're going to look at 4 studies. Are there ideological differences in the effects of party cues when we use these different samples of stimuli, when we use multiple measures of ideology, when we measure possible psychological differences, and we're going to do this in pretty high-powered studies. So our first 2 studies are with existing data. So what happened here, 2 different authors sets of researchers, they did studies with representative samples of issues. They were doing it for other reasons, but they posted their data online, and then we downloaded their data and did the analyses that we wanted to do for our research question. Both of these samples are from quasi-representative samples of the United States. They had between 1,500 and 2,700 participants, so these are very large samples. And in each of these studies, they respond to party cues they respond to 6 different issues, some of those with party cues and some of those without. So it's a within-person experiment. I go back. And then we have 2 measures of ideology. So one is a measure of partisanship, which is whether somebody is a strong Democrat to strong Republican. So this is just more party support. It's not exactly ideology, but it's close. And then one is their partisanship and ideological identity. So again, partisanship, so just strong Democrat to strong Republican, or ideological identification, which is strong liberal to strong conservative. And so these are really standard item measures in this literature. So in study 1, this is what a cue looked like. It was done back when Donald Trump was president. And so they would ask people about an issue, and then they would show what Barack Obama, the most recent Democratic president, said, or what Donald Trump said. In the second study, it's the same sort of idea, but it's all verbal. And so they say there's been a debate about this policy. Democrats are more likely to favor it, while Republicans are more likely to oppose, or the reverse. So they just tell you whether your party or the other party is more likely to favor or oppose it. So a key thing here is where do we get the issues? In study 1, there's 34 total issues. They went on this website called isidewith.com, which is just a website that allows you to figure out which politicians support your point of view by having you answer survey questions about policies. And so they have a ton of information on this. And they drew from this and basically took all of the relevant policies. In the second study, what they did is they went to this database called the Roper Center iPoll database. Some libraries have access to this, but they collect all of the polling questions that are asked to Americans by major polling companies for all the time. And they went to the prior year and grabbed all of the different policy questions from that, and then randomly sampled 48 from them. So what we do then is we have all these party queues. They get a party queue for each issue that they're assigned. And we're trying to predict whether the queue is different by political ideology. So this is a multi-level model, but the key thing we want to do here is we're looking at this interaction between ideology and queue. So this tells us if the average ideological differences across issues in terms of queue. So if it's positive, this suggests that there's support for the asymmetry perspective because it suggests that conservatives have a larger queue effect. If it's a null or close to zero, it suggests that support for the symmetry perspective because it suggests there's no ideological differences in queue. So my fonts are disagreeing, but that's okay. We also, for the symmetry perspective, since we're predicting a zero effect, that's always tough with significance testing. How do you say that something's really zero? Because you can't, you're always testing if something's different from zero. That's what statistics do. And so instead we specify the smallest effect size of interest, and we look to see if our effect is consistently smaller than that. And for that, we chose this effect of 0.05, which is actually super, super tiny already. And so if we're finding effects smaller than that, we're finding super small effects. All right. So here is, these models have more than this in it. I'm just highlighting the key interaction from the models. This is the political party by queue interaction. So if this were positive, that would be support for the asymmetry perspective. And if it was zero, it's support for the symmetry perspective. And you can see in study one here, that interaction effect is right on zero. So there's no difference in queue susceptibility across these issues. And we can look at, when we look at the simple slopes for Democrats and Republicans in our sample. So remember, Democrats are the more left-wing liberal side of things. Republicans are more conservative right-wing side of things. You'd expect that Republicans should have a larger queue effect from the asymmetry perspective, and that's not what we find. When we look at the Clifford et al. Data, they also have this partisanship measure. We get the exact same result, almost exactly the same size, actually. And they also have a measure of ideology, so liberal versus conservative identification. And here we also find a non-significant interaction, although it's not quite as tiny, although it is still very tiny. Just to highlight why it's useful to look at all of these issues, is this is all the effect across all of the different issues. And you can see the ones at the bottom there, those ones suggest that people on the left are more susceptible to queues. Those are ones about the president, whether the president can make specific companies tax exempt, or whether officials can lobby for businesses and government, or like how long that needs to be before they start doing that. Or something called the estate tax, which actually I don't totally understand, but Americans talk about it all the time. As I find that I'm supposed to know about politics, and I just not act like I know what the estate tax is. And then at the top, though, those are ones that show that conservatives are more susceptible to these cues. And had we just chosen some of those issues at the top or just some of those issues at the bottom, we would have come to totally different conclusions. And instead, by looking across this representative sample of issues, we can see that actually there's maybe no clear effect. So on average, we find that there's no ideological differences, and there's variation across issues. So in study 3, what we wanted to know is why are there no ideological differences? So it could be the case that maybe this happens with other measures of ideology. These are just not capturing things well enough. Or it could be that maybe, this idea that there's these psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, maybe that just doesn't hold in our samples anymore. And so they don't even have the psychology necessary to be susceptible to cues, to be somebody who uses cues a lot. So we did a study using Prolific. Prolific is this platform that allows you to recruit participants from the internet. It's kind of like mTurk, which maybe some other people have used. We collected a sample of almost 1,700 people, half Republicans, half Democrats. This is exactly the same as study 1, except that we used a new set of issues and we used more issues. And we measured ideology and psychological processes. So, and then because we ran it actually just a few months ago, and when we were running it, we were unsure who was going to be the presidential candidates because there was some ambiguity for a while. But we just said Republican leaders and Democratic leaders rather than specific candidates. So we have 37 total issues. We also used I side with, but there were more issues to sort through this time because there are just over time, more issues have accumulated on the website. So we measured partisanship and ideological identification like we did in the last study. We also included this measure called right-wing authoritarianism, which I will show some items for, but it captures kind of a sort of traditional values mixed with following the leader kind of ideas. And then this measure called the progressive values scale, which tries to get at really extreme progressive values, especially regarding things related to race and how we should treat marginalized groups within the United States. We code everything so that higher scores are like more conservative right wing. So everything, you'd expect everything to kind of be positive. And these are all positively correlated to some degree. We also measured cognitive style. We used the cognitive reflection task, which is a multiple choice test that is a reasoning test. And actually they're math problems, and they're simple math problems. The math you need to solve them is easy, but they're phrased in a way that really pulls your intuition. And it pulls it so that you're wrong. And so we actually find that in the study, which is online, and they could cheat, 50% get the like average right answer. So if this is a test for a class, they would fail. And then we have two self-report measures. One is called need for closure and what's called dogmatism. And then you can't tell, but they're positively correlated but weaker. There's like around these first two that say 0.93, these are recodes of the cognitive reflection task. There's just different ways to do it. And then the other ones are, they're about 0.1, 0.2 correlations with each other. So this is a right-wing authoritarianism scale. For those who haven't seen it, it's a short scale. But so this first item is one that's reverse scored. It's great that many young people today are prepared to defy authority. Whereas the one below it, also kind of getting at this authority component, but this one is not reverse scored. So what our country needs most is discipline with everyone following our leaders' unity. Or, the one at the bottom is my favorite one because it's really dramatic, but it's basically like, because there's so much crime and disorder, we need to like punish people more. That's that kind of idea. I don't like it because I support it. I like it because I find the wording very dramatic. The progressive value scale is this, it's a newer scale actually, but it's about questions about affirmative action and minority rights, essentially. The cognitive reflection task has these three questions. Some versions of this task do it open-ended and people type in their answers, and we did not want to code 1,700 typed in answers. And so we used a multiple choice version. So for each of these questions, they have 4 answer options. And one is the correct answer. One is the intuitively wrong answer, and the other 2 are just other options. And so you can see this first one, a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Anybody have, well, nobody wants to do math on the spot, I understand. So the wrong answer is 10 cents. That's the wrong answer. And so, but the right answer is 5 cents. So people get this wrong. It's fine. I have to think through these every time I present them. And so if you looked at this and you got it wrong, you're totally normal. So don't worry. When the people who made this scale, they did it with students from, I think, Yale. They're supposed to be smart at Yale. This is what I'm told. And the students at Yale also do terrible. So like, nobody does good. The need for closure self-report scale, about just how much you like situations that are uncertain or not. So I don't like situations that are uncertain. Straightforward. And then the dogmatism scale. I actually don't like this scale very much, but it's used a lot, so that's why we have it. And part of the reason I don't like it is that it really confounds just being confident in your beliefs with being like unreasonably confident in your beliefs. And it's also not always clear what they mean by beliefs. And so I think depending on so like the second item there, I've never discovered a system of beliefs that explains everything to my satisfaction. Depending on a lot of what you mean by beliefs there shifts how you answer that question. If you're thinking about religious beliefs, you're gonna maybe answer one way, but if you're thinking about like beliefs about like how the political system works, you might have a totally different answer. And it seems like that is like a real problem with the scale, just to be clear. And a particularly devout participant emailed me to yell at me about this scale. So it's fair. They're not wrong. So this is the correlation between ideology and these psychological variables. This is the need for closure. And you can see that except for the progressive value scale, more conservatives score higher in the need for closure. They score higher on dogmatism. Those effects are a little bit larger. And they score on the more intuitive, less deliberative side of the cognitive reflection task, no matter how we code it. Now, so this suggests that in our sample, conservatives have the Q susceptible psychological profile. So we should see this Q effect. So then we run our analyses. These are the same analysis as last time, just now with more ideology measures. So again, x-axis is the size of the interaction effect. And then on the y-axis is our different ideology variables. And actually here, across party and ideology and right-wing authoritarianism, we find that conservatives are more susceptible to Qs than our liberals, which is the opposite of the first two studies. For the progressive value scale, we again find about a 0 effect. When we look at the psychological variables, you don't get much for the cognitive reflection task and its recodings. Need for closure, people high in need for closure tend to be more susceptible to the Qs, and people higher in dogmatism tend to be more susceptible to the Qs. This effect, just to be clear, is a little bit weird actually if you think about it. The dogmatic people are saying, my beliefs are absolutely correct. And then we're like, here, this leader supports this attitude. And they're like, yes, I will change my attitude. So it is a little bit of a weird finding in that one. So maybe conservatives are more susceptible to party Qs after all. So this is a mixed finding. This is, if you're watching this and you're like, wait, didn't he just say the opposite earlier? Yeah, I did. The data is different. So why is there differences? So one might be that it's just random chance. You run enough studies, you find different patterns of results. I don't think so because our samples are super big and our estimates for this are really precise. It could be that we have different issues in our study compared to the prior studies. That's true, but we have in the very first study, in our study, we do have some that overlap. Not perfectly, but we have some. And when you look at those, we find differences, overall differences in our study, that top purple on the right, and then that original one, the top purple on the left, you find no difference. So it doesn't seem to be the issues. It could be a different sample type. So prolific participants tend to be really experienced, and which is not necessarily a bad thing because they pay attention to your survey. They almost never fail attention checks. They are attentive, but they might be a little strange. And there's some work that suggests that this is the case. They compared a ton of different sample providers in the United States. Prolific, super attentive, but on political stuff, they look actually a little bit strange. And in particular, there's a very famous finding in political science that frames policies as helping the poor or helping people on welfare. And they replicate this in their more representative samples, but less professional samples. But in prolific, they find the opposite result. So that, I read that after we ran the study, and I was like, well, that would have been nice to know before. And so it seems like prolific might have something weird going on with political stuff, although we're not sure exactly what it is. And then the final one is that maybe there's changes over time. So the original studies were run back in 2018, 2020. Maybe the kind of, the following the leaders and so on has just changed a little bit. American politics has been weird the last few years. Maybe something's going on. So I don't think it's these first two, but these last two are possible. It's really hard to rule out changes over time unless we run this study basically every year for the next 15 to 20 years. Nobody's offering to pay me to do that. And so instead, we're going to try to rule out the sample type, and then we can maybe go from there. So we've collected this actually just about like a month after the last study. We used this polling firm called Bovitz Forthright, which isn't so important except that it's different than prolific. We have about 1,400 participants. Otherwise, the study is identical to the last study I showed you. Same measures, same issues, everything is the same. So we first look at these correlations again. They actually look almost identical to the prior study. You find that conservatives are higher need for closure, higher in dogmatism, they're less deliberative thinkers. So they have this Q susceptible profile again. But now we look at our interactions, and now they're back to 0. So now we have no ideological differences in partisan Qs, except for right-wing authoritarianism. So for those of you who like stats, that's a p-value of 0.04. That's what that looks like. That interaction is barely significant, but it's significant. And there you find that conservatives or people high in right-wing authoritarianism do seem to follow Qs more. Now you might ask yourself, or ask me, Mark, that right-wing authoritarianism scale, you showed us the items, and some of the items are like, we should follow leaders. And then we say, Republican leaders say this, maybe they're just following the leader. Good question. We ran these same analyses, but with those items just by themselves, and it's not that. Like all of the right-wing authoritarianism items all look kind of the same in terms of this kind of interaction. So it's not driven just by this following the leader component of right-wing authoritarianism. And then the progressive value scale continues to kind of do its own thing. It's a little bit less precisely estimated. And then when we look at the psychological variables, the cognitive reflection task, no matter how you code it, basically the same result, but there's no interaction there. So this does not, Qs don't matter for this. Qs also don't matter for need for closure. And the dogmatism is getting closer to significance, but it's also not significant. So in our fourth study here, we go from study 3, lots of significant interactions all the time, and now we get none, except for maybe the right-wing authoritarians. So altogether here we have each of our studies in each of the columns here, and then the measures of ideology on the rows. And what we find is that in study 3, this prolific sample, if we just look at this sample, we looked at conservatives are biased. They show more of this Q susceptibility. But if we look at any of the other studies, the overall conclusion is not that conservatives are more biased. There's maybe one hint of something, but that's it. And so one of these things is not like the other. And so it could be that prolific is a bit strange here. On the measure side too, if you look across the measures, right-wing authoritarianism also seems to maybe be doing something else. And so it's a little hard to tell because maybe prolific was weird as well. We really need to do the Forthright study again or something. I don't want to, this is expensive stuff, so I'm not really looking to do this a lot more. But you know, there's potentially something going on with right-wing authoritarians. So where do I think I stand on this? I think there's probably some small ideological differences in party Q following from right-wing authoritarianism. I think that's possible. I think there's unlikely to be differences in partisanship or ideological identification or progressive values. There might be, if we look at maybe, there's measures of left-wing authoritarianism now that people use. Maybe those would show something different too. I mean, we could, but you know, I think at a certain point, we've got to not throw every possible measure at this, but you know, I think these are reasonable set. So I don't think that this is widespread ideological differences. Most of our estimates cannot rule out super, super small differences. So this, like, and I want to be like these differences that like our smallest effect size of interest is super small. Most of the estimates are smaller than that. And we have really large samples here. So I think like at best, even when it's significant, we have really small effects. And this is even when we have really large samples. It also suggests, I think, that we have a sample representative, might be a lurking moderator here. Our last study was more representative than our third study. Methods are identical. If they were run within weeks of each other, we get different results. I think that's something to be a concern as we're planning future studies. Issue representative, I think, is really necessary here. Depending on what issues you look at, it bounces around. I didn't show that for every study, but it happens all the time. If you choose just one subset of issues, you'll get different answers. I also think we need to identify how big of a difference becomes a meaningful ideological difference. Just any effect size as being meaningful kind of bugs me because just then you could have the tiniest effect size be an ideological difference. And not sure that that necessarily supports the theory in the same way as a larger, more robust effect size. And I think finally, there's probably not one true ideological difference. It probably depends a little bit on the measures, and depending on what we learn about how these samples are similar or different, what's going on there. I think I have a couple of closing thoughts, and then we'll learn from our other speaker. But so we're finding similarities in psychological processes. I think that's really important. This is not similarity in content. They still disagree with each other, okay? And I think that is important because here is some social media posts from a candidate in the United States. You might recognize him. And why he has cats here is not because he thinks cats are cute, but rather because there was this vile rumor and lie about immigrants from Haiti in the US that they were eating pets. And then this was used to cause anti-immigrant attitudes and feelings in the US. So this is an elite queue. This is what an elite queue looks like in real life. And the consequences of that is that people called in bomb threats to schools in the city with lots of Haitian immigrants. So that's, I think, a similar psychological process, but the content of that is really different. You know, at least in the US and at least in this year, this time in life, the liberals are not causing people to call in bomb threats. And that is a consequential difference. Although I still maintain the psychological process is probably pretty similar. Okay, my last closing thought, this is my real closing thought. So this project is super American. It's American because I have American data, but it's also American because the party Q literature in general is super American. Party Qs do matter in other political contexts. They've done studies outside the US, not lots, but they've done them. But it's less prominent in contexts where there's lots of political parties and where people do not identify much with political parties, which makes sense. So actually, like, from my understanding of Indonesian politics, my money would be that these do not work very well here. I'll let you all tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. At the same time, that doesn't mean that group leader cues don't matter. It just might be that political group leaders don't matter. And so maybe it's other leader cues, maybe religious leaders, or maybe other leaders in the community. Maybe university leaders have strong cues in some countries, not in any country I live in, but like maybe a mythical country out there where they respect universities. And so I think there's ways that this can be similar or different in identifying how that's the case across countries. I think is useful. And so then whether or not this left-right ideology is relevant for these party cues in other political contexts is an open question. We just don't really know. It might be, it might not be. There's also other ideological dimensions that I didn't say anything about here. So there's this other ideological dimension that shows up in some countries that rather from left-wing to right-wing, it's more of like a security profile to a freedom profile is how it's described, where security is like support for welfare spending and social traditional values, whereas the freedom side is like less state intervention into the economy and more kind of civil liberties for a variety of different socially marginalized groups. That could maybe play out cues differently. I have no idea. Nobody's tested it, so maybe we can. All right, that's what I have. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Doctor. That was very, very insightful. I have so many questions, but we can save it for later. Okay. And now we're gonna move on with Dr. Winda.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, guys, she's standing. It's about to get serious, y'all.
I know. It's not that serious. You're making me nervous.
All right. Oh ya, teman-teman yang di Zoom, kalau ada pertanyaan, masukin di chat aja. Pakai bahasa Indonesia boleh, nanti aku terjemahin.
Oh ya, udah pakai ini aja deh. Pakai mama aja deh. di bawah nggak bisa. Boleh. Alright, selamat siang, good afternoon everyone. My name is Winda Yustisia. I'm here today to share my research. This research is kind of like a very similar topic to what just Dr. Brand shared with you all. It's about ideological differences, but here I'm going to discuss how ideological differences might be observed in belief superiority. So this topic is actually a new topic for me, and it's been like 6 months I learned about this. And meanwhile, Dr. Brand has been known for this research like for a very long time. So it's kind of like make me nervous to talk about this right in front of him actually. More nervous than when I had my defense. I prepared myself for my defense for about 4 years, but here, only like 3 months. Okay, so it is a fun research I did after I just finished my dissertation, and it turned out to be interesting. So I ran some analysis and write a publication from this study. So this is a collaborative work with my previous advisor, Victor Atati, my colleague here in University of Indonesia, Jufarian, Widiana, Mario Muhammad Fauzan, Khairullah Fadli, Salma was my friend in Loyola, and also Tade Dwita Apriani from University Udayana in Bali. So the central issue that drives me to understand, to do this study is about our current politics situation. Yesterday, I had just talked with Mark how American and Indonesian politics kind of depressing right now. There are many political disagreements. One of the reasons is because people from different political spectrums feel superior about their belief, right? It means that people tend to have, believe that their opinion or political stance much more correct than others. So from this phenomenon, I am interested in understanding whether there is like ideological differences in belief superiority. There are some hypotheses that can help us to address that kind of question, and actually Dr. Brand has explained a lot about this, and I think I can skip this introduction part. It's similar, very similar actually. The theory is the same, but maybe I will go briefly to that section. But before going there, I would like to introduce you a little about this concept if you don't know yet. Belief superiority, so it basically individual conviction about their attitude or belief, whether they are better or much more correct than others. So this concept is similar to other constructs like attitude certainty, which is individuals clarity about their attitude confidence, which is about individual conviction about their the validity of their attitude, and or like perceived self-expertise, like individuals believe about their knowledge they have in certain area. They all look similar to belief superiority, but none of them involve comparison. So I mean, like, you can feel certain about your attitude, but you don't necessarily feel superior in your belief, right? So, and also you may confidence about your belief, but you may not feel superior. And also you may feel expert on an issue, but you don't feel superior about that, your belief in that issue. So how existing literature explain about the relationship between ideology and belief superiority. There are two main hypotheses, or Dr. Brand explained about ideological symmetry and ideological asymmetry approaches. So it's kind of similar actually. So now I would like to start with the rigidity of the right hypothesis. So this hypothesis basically say that one spectrum of ideology tend to have higher need, higher epistemic need, in this case, conservative. Epistemic need is, individuals' need for certainty, knowledge, and avoid ambiguity, and it affects how people process information. So, for example, they might be more rigid cognitively and have higher desire for order and closure. They are more motivated to protect group-related possession, and also they express overly positive judgment about their political views. So based on these findings, I think that maybe if we use this hypothesis as a foundation, we may say that conservative may foster a stronger sense of belief superiority, because by having higher belief superiority, we can maintain certainty, coherence, and also protect our existing political stances and avoid changes. So that's the first explanation. Alternatively, maybe ideological extremism hypothesis could explain. So the idea here, it's not about whether you are conservative or liberal, but it's about how extreme your ideology is. So here it argues that conservative and liberal extremists both possess strong epistemic motives compared to the moderate ones. So previous research has shown that those are extremists from both spectrum of ideology tend to have lower integrative complexity, higher cognitive inflexibility, and higher judgmental certainty. They also related to confidence, attitude confidence, certainty, and also absolute certainty in one's political belief. So based on this research, there have been two studies that try to understand whether it means that ideological extremism can better explain belief superiority in compared to rigidity of the right using US sample. And this study was conducted by Turner and Harris Van Bevel in 2013 and 2021 respectively, and they both found that a robust curvilinear relationship between ideology and superiority. In this case, ideology was measured as attitude toward political issues. They had like several issues being involved there. It is absolutely American issues. And here, curvilinear relationship means that the ideological hypothesis, extremism hypothesis, is more correct. So people who are extreme in both spectrum of ideology tend to be more superior, feel more superior about their belief than those in moderate position. And then in this paper, in this study, we proposed that maybe both of the hypotheses are correct, because evident, as Dr. Brand said earlier, that both of approaches or hypotheses have some support, right? So that's why there might be kind of like a simultaneous determinants here. So maybe both of ideological hypothesis and rigidity of the right hypothesis can predict, belief superiority in this case. So this evidence is also kind of like, this idea kind of like supported by Harris Van Bevel when predicting dogmatism. And alternatively, it is we may think that they're kind of like the moderating boundary condition approach, where either ideological extremism or rigidity of the right hypothesis might work at certain conditions, especially related to the issue being used. So this explanation came up just, like a year ago when I met Stern in a conference where he, explained about how he found that there is a finding that conservatism is associated with overconfidence when participants make non-political judgment. It means that rigidity of the right is true when the stimulus is about non-political judgment, but when the issue is related to political judgment in general, ideological extremism is true. So based on these studies, we argue that maybe another possible explanation or prediction here is that the relationship between ideology and belief superiority depend on the type of the issue. So that's the main idea. We want to see the relationship between ideology and belief superiority. To extend previous studies, we also want to see the moderating role of political expertise. Here, experts were defined as individuals who are more capable of comprehending the structure of ideological orientations and thus more often to show consistency between ideology and their psychological needs compared to non-experts. So previous research showed that experts tend to have a consistency between their ideology and their psychological profiles. So previous research showed that conservatives tend to be more rigid cognitively, tend to more dogmatic, tend to have higher cognitive inflexibility that will be stronger or more likely to happen among experts than non-expert, because experts can better understand the structure of ideology, so they can fit in the ideology, kind of ideology that can meet their needs. So that's the idea here. So we think that maybe the rigidity of the right hypothesis will be more strongly supported among political experts. On the other hand, the ideological extremism hypothesis will be more strongly supported among non-political experts. So speaking of political ideology, this study is unique, and also it has a novelty because we measure it in terms of Indonesian political ideology. While in majority of literature we have right now talking about liberalism and conservatism, we have lack of data how ideological differences might happen in psychological variables outside of liberal and conservative categorization. Here in Indonesia, we actually have a single political ideology, what we call as Pancasila ideology, but actually we have like 20 parties that can be, categorized into two spectrums of ideology. They have different idea about the integration of religion and politics, or religion and public life. So in one side, we call it in the right side, there is like religious parties here who tend to support, who have higher support to the integration of religion and politics, and those in the left side who is more secular, that tend to clearly separate religion from public or political life. So here we operationalize political ideology in terms of secular and religious dimension. So as an overview, this study aims to examine ideological differences in belief superiority in a non-weird cultural context, especially in Indonesia, which is I think the first one here. We use social and political issues that divide secular and religious groups in Indonesia. We address this question in study 1 and study 2, and in the second study, we specifically examine the moderating effect of political expertise. So study 1, for study 1, we had 1,468 participants from a nationally representative data. If Dr. Brand said that there is a representativeness issue in this topic, in this research topic, we have the representative national data here. And as you can see here, most of them were Muslim, and then the mean age of 43.10, and then about 50% were female. And in addition to a single overall political ideology I had just mentioned earlier, we also have attitudinal measure where we ask participants the degree to which they agree or disagree with this issue, namely alcohol ban, women leadership restriction, stand faith leader, religious-based policy, religious country. So for the religious country means that whether they support Indonesia being a Islamic country or not. And then they responded on a scale from 1 to 7. And then for belief superiority, we asked them to rate to what extent they think that their belief about each issues I mentioned earlier more correct compared to others. They responded on a scale from 1 to 4. 1 is no more correct than other viewpoints. 2 slightly more correct than other viewpoints. 3 is more correct than other viewpoints, and 4 totally correct compared other viewpoints. And for the ideology, so in the actual questionnaire, we have instruction first. We explain that what secular means and then what religious means, because not all Indonesian lay people are familiar with this term. So we define it first at the instructions, and then after that we ask them whether where they position themselves between these two lines, these two views, from 1 strongly secular to 7 strongly religious. And this is the main finding here, as you can see. So the finding, so I did the analysis using regression, where I have linear and quadratic term, where each term is included hierarchically. And this finding you see in on the screen coming from the final model, which is the step 2 model. So as you can see here, in most of the in all of the issue, we found a quadratic effect, or quadratic term was significant, meaning that ideological hypotheses were supported across issues, even using like all issues combined analysis or data, and also overall political ideology. In terms of linear relationship or linear term, you can see here not all of them got the support. So we got support for linear term effect or rigidity of the right hypothesis for the issue like alcohol ban, women leadership restrictions, same-faith leader, religion-based policy, but not for religious country. We got it for all issues, average issue score, but not for overall political ideology. So overall, in 5 of the 7 analyses, the results of study 1 obtain support for the simultaneous determinants approach. And the issues include alcohol ban, women leadership, same-faith leader, religion-based policy, and all issues combined analysis. Only 2 of the 7 analyses yielded support for the ideological extremism hypothesis, which can be seen from the quadratic term analysis, without obtaining support for the rigidity of the right or linear hypothesis. So we kind of found like more evidence for simultaneous determinants explanation. In a second study, we ran another survey, another national survey. In total, we had 1,726 participants. Again, this is a national representative, but We focus on young population here, so the participant age start from 17 until 40, and the mean age here 30 years old, and then half of them were female, and then most of them were Muslims. And we use attitudinal and overall ideology measures again. And here the issue is similar actually, but there are some changes here because of, like limitation space constraints. For your information, we ran this study through a polling company for free. So we do not have that, ability to, that privilege to give questions as many as possible. We can only have like 2 pages maximum. So this is the issue that we can get in across study 1 and in studies 2. So in study 2, we got these issues here: women leadership, recognition of LGBT rights, the influence of leaders' faith in religion, and in the incorporation of religious beliefs in government policies. So there are some same issues there, but some are different. We also included dogmatism scale here, but the main purpose here really just to know whether the relationship between ideology and belief superiority, as we observed in study 1, will be the same after controlling for dogmatism as an individual variable here. We also analyzed some data to predict dogmatism. We reported in our paper, but I didn't present it here. But it's kind of like interesting mark because we didn't find any linear or quadratic term in predicting dogmatism. Yeah. So the main purpose here is just to see whether the role of dogmatism as a control variable. Again, because of space constraint, we can only have 2 questions. So we try our best to choose like 2 out of 7 items in the dogmatism scale. And we end up giving this scale here. Anyone who is honestly and truly seeking the truth will end up believing what I believe. And if you are open-minded about the most important things in life, you will probably reach the wrong conclusions. So I don't know whether we can really trust the finding about dogmatism here, but yeah, but here we got it. Here what we got. And for political expertise, we measure it using 2 indicators here. First, we operationalize it in terms of political interest. We ask whether participants interested in politics, and we ask them to respond on a scale from 1 to 4. 1 is not interested at all, 2 not interested, and 3 interested, and 4 very interested. And then we, categorize the scores again, so that 1 and 2 goes to not interested, 3 and 4 goes to interested, and we found that 61.2% of participants have a low political interest. And like it is like young generation actually, but they are not really, most of them not really interested in, politics. And second, we also operationalize it in terms of political information seeking. So we ask them to answer this question: how often do you intentionally search for political information on the internet, like Googling? And they responded on a scale from 1 to 4. 1 is never, 2 rarely, once a week, 3 often, 2 until 3 times a week, and 4 always every day. And this is the main finding. So first, in contrast to study 1, we didn't find the linear effect again here in this issue, but we still get quadratic effect, which provides support for the ideological extremism hypothesis. For LGBT rights issue, which is a new issue here, We found both linear and quadratic effect. For same faith leader issue, we again found both of the effect, linear and quadratic effect. For religion-based policy, this is a new issue. We again found both of the effect, linear and quadratic effect. For all issues combined, we again found both linear and quadratic effect. Interestingly, for overall political ideology measure, we again only found quadratic effect, but not linear effect. I think it is something. And we also, next we ran an analysis controlling dogmatism as a control variable here, and the result diminishing. So even after control for the dogmatism as covariant, we found similar findings. And then we try to understand the moderating effect political interest. We hope to find something here, but unfortunately, no. So we didn't have any significant interaction effect between linear or quadratic with political interest or political, information seeking. So no hypothesis for everything for the moderating effect were supported here. So from study 2, we found that when predicting belief superiority, the pattern of results was virtually identical with or without inclusion of dogmatism as control variable, where overall in the 4 of the 6 analysis, the results obtain support for the simultaneous determinants approach. Only 2 of the 6 analysis obtain support for the ideological extremism or quadratic hypothesis without obtaining support for the rigidity of the right or linear hypothesis. So, and no moderation effect of political expertise was found. I'm not sure why, maybe measurement issue, maybe political interest or political information seeking is not really representative to see people's expertiseness. I don't know, maybe that could be one reason. And interestingly here, for the woman leadership issue, there is kind of like, so while the other issues, finding for the other issues remain the same, replicated in the second study, but for the woman leadership issue, not replicated. So there was a support for the simultaneous determinants approach in study 1, but not in study 2. We are not sure why. The main difference between study 1 and study 2 is the sample. While in study 1, we use all age from 17 until 65 or something. But in study 2, we use only a young population between 17 until 40 years old. I'm not sure how that could explain it, but that's the only difference we have from study 1 and study 2. And interestingly, in both study 1 and study 2, we found the overall ideology, which is a single overarching construct measure, produce a significant quadratic effect, but a non-significant linear effect. One possible reason that we can have to explain this finding is it may be this kind of measurement can produce like saliency in people's political identity. So that's why it's producing kind of like, sense of belief superiority in both of spectrum of ideology. You know what I mean? So it means that when the political identity is salient, people across spectrum can feel really, think about their ideology so that they may feel, and think about their political position a lot more, so that's why it triggers them to feel like superior about their belief. And in conclusion, I just want to re-emphasize it. So in both study, we found simultaneous effect when using average issue a specific ideology to predict average belief superiority of the specific issues, and also with the specific issues, And interestingly, however, this was not the case when using a single global measure of secular versus secular versus religious ideology. In this measure, we only found, ideological extremism hypothesis or quadratic effect. It seems like the rigidity of the right effect is more likely to emerge when focusing on specific issues belief and less likely to appear when using a more global assessment ideology. So for the future, it might be interesting to understand, is there any other psychological reason to explain why people, why simultaneous effect can observe when people focusing on specific issues only, but not when they have this, like political ideology measure. It might be related to political identity salience or maybe something else. All right, I think that's it from me. Thank you.
So much, Bawita. That was super insightful. You guys, this is why like cross-cultural studies, especially like cross-cultural psychology is like super important, because just because people have like similar psychological processes on like different sides of this earth doesn't mean that we can just like replicate studies in like a different culture. Because like as like both these amazing people have highlighted, like in both in the United States and Indonesia, like what's important to people in those two societies are like quite different. For example, like in Indonesia, people's like political ideology or like political beliefs or even like their sense of self is like strongly tied to religion. That's why they prefer to have leaders with like the same religious beliefs as them. Whereas like in the US, religion is not, I don't think it's like a highlight. Like when I lived in New York, no one really like cared too much about religion, but they cared a lot about race. Like everything is about like, oh, what's like your ethnic group, like where are you from? That's like a huge conversation there, but it's not necessarily like a huge conversation here. So yeah, I think it's like really important to adjust like research methodologies to like accommodate to those differences. So yeah, oh my God, so cool you guys. Does anyone have any questions? Ada pertanyaan nggak mungkin di Zoom bisa diketik aja. Pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa, I will like translate. Gimana Mbak, ada pertanyaan nggak? Belum. Okay, me first then. Okay, so okay, I have a question for Dr. Brand.
Sure.
So you mentioned that like conservatives have like higher susceptibility to like partisan cues, and like that kind of reminded me of this research about like people's perceptions of like the California wildfires a few years ago. Apparently they found that Republicans were less likely to evacuate compared to Democrats. But I just saw like another study by Stanford in like 2020. They said that after like those like huge wildfires, there's actually like a reduction in those like partisan differences. So like to me, it kind of seems like they have to be like doomed first to be able to like open their mind to like different like opinions or like ideologies. But like from your perspective as like political psychologist, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly why. I'm not familiar with these studies, so I don't want to speak to them exactly. But like I think what's totally plausible is that if you get elite cues and you don't have other good information, or you don't want to find other good information, and so you follow those elite cues, that makes sense. But then sometimes life hits you over the head with something more concrete, and this might be enough to kind of like, it just might be more kind of useful information in a way. And so then people are less swayed by the cues because now they have this personal experience. I mean, I think with like one of the things I didn't show you in our data, because I talked for long enough anyways, but is that we did some analyses trying to figure out what issues do you see bigger or smaller cue effects on, and bigger or smaller ideological differences. And part of it is that on issues where people have, well, before they ever get a queue, they have really strong attitudes about, you don't move anybody on those. And so I think, like, I can imagine with the wildfire situation, if it wasn't something you had to worry about before, you don't have a strong attitude about it, you get a cue that says you don't need to leave, you follow that. But then you actually experience it and you're like, oh, that was terrible. Then you have a strong attitude on it, and then the cue is less meaningful. So I think, like, yeah, the partisan cues are not just the only thing going on. People have other information probably considered.
So there's like a ton of like other variables that come into play.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, like, if the effect, I don't show this in the talk because it's not our focus, but the effect size of cues overall is about 8% of the scale range. So that's like, we have our scale range is from 0 to 1, and it's like changing from being a 0.2 to being a 0.28. And so, like, that's not a big effect. So it's not nothing, but it's also, we're not like taking people and, you know, when they're not like going from like being, you know, anti-minimum wage to being the biggest proponents of raising the minimum wage. It's more like you're just nudging them a little bit.
Sounds like it has like a lot of like really important policy implications.
Yeah, so this is something they draw on when they talk about like vaccines and stuff and getting people to take vaccines. And when during the pandemic, we're getting people to master the pandemic, was highlighting that trying to get Republicans and Democrats, both leaders, to kind of say these are good things, do these things. Because even in those cases, if you just change people even just a few percentage points, that might be enough to slow the spread and stuff like that. So,
thank you so much, Dr. Brandt. Looks like we have a question here from Lara Sakarasi. Hello, Dr. Brandt and UCCI. Thank you for the insightful presentations. I have 2 questions related to belief rigidity. Number 1, should we construe belief superiority or rigidity as a trait, which might result from years of learning, or something that's more short term? Number 2, is belief superiority something that we can or should intervene? Number 3, related to question number 2, what would be the potential policy implications for the findings? So this is a question for both of you, so you can just choose whichever who wants to answer first.
oh, it's for you.
Maybe I can start that. Yeah, thank you, Balaras Sekarasi, for the question. So yeah, so for the first question is, existing leader, I would say that both of them true. So it could be either like a general trait or maybe situational or context specific. Like, you know, people can have generally feeling superior about every aspect of their life, or maybe they may feel superior only in certain issue, in politics maybe, but not in, I don't know, in other issue like religion, social issues maybe. So in my study, I focus on political belief superiority, which is like, you know, people believe about the superiority of their belief in political context. And whether it is short term or long term, I'm not sure. Also, yeah, if it is a general belief superiority or maybe a trait, we see it as a trait variable, it will have an impact for long term. But for a situational or context specific belief superiority, it might be like, you know, for certain contexts, conditions, or period of time maybe. And if we talk about intervention or policy implication, I'm not sure. I mean, like belief superiority is something like this is something that I've just talked with Mario and every others in the political science lab yesterday. To be clear, I'm not saying that belief superiority is bad. Okay, so I'm saying that there is some consequences you may have if you have a belief superiority. You may have like bias in processing information and so on and so on. But I mean, like research show that people have this natural tendency to feel like their belief is more correct than others, right? Because of this, motivation for self-enhancement and so on and so on. But for sure, there are some people who have this positive illusion, exaggerate their positiveness and something like that. So if that being something that can have a detrimental effect for in certain conditions, I know that there is a study which shows that the difference between actual knowledge and perceived knowledge among those with low and high belief superiority. And they found that those high in belief superiority have higher gap between their their actual and perceived knowledge. So they think they know something, but it's actually not. So you may use this kind of intervention to make high belief superiority individuals to think like, oh, come on, you think you know what you're doing, you think that your belief is the best, let's check it out, okay? Answer this question. Do you think it's, do you know the answer of this question? Do you think it is the correct one or not? And so on and so on. So make them realize that you are not you might not as good as you think. That one thought for me. If you want to add, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether belief superiority is good or bad depends almost entirely on how right you are. And the problem is that it's very difficult to know how right you are.
Yeah.
And so like, if you are like, if you think about like, if your belief superiority about the, what 2 + 2 equals, 2 + 2 equals 4. Yeah. I have very high belief superiority to that answer. Yeah. I think that's fine. But a lot of the things that we're actually asking this question about, it's, it's like, there's policies that I have strong opinions about. I think I'm right, but like, I don't really know. And actually it's almost impossible to know unless you do an experiment on a country, which is unethical. So we won't know. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about how it can be changed, because because if people are inaccurate, I think Laura's question here is like, could we change it so that at least when they're inaccurate, they maybe moderate it? And yeah, it'd be interesting to think about how that's possible, but I don't know that. I have no idea.
Okay, well, I hope that answers your question, Mbak Laras. Does anyone else have any questions?
Di sini ada Mario.
Di sini, Mario, mau nanya?
Lagi nyusun.
He's trying to comprehend. He's trying to comprehend everything.
I'll just
okay. That's
question from Professor Mark. So currently in USA, in upcoming weeks, we have election. So which party or maybe which leader are you supporting? And maybe you will be voting to Harris and Kamala, maybe Donald Trump.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I say to this kind of question typically is for academic reasons, I stay roughly neutral, but you would be able to predict my vote if you predicted what most professors in the US would vote for. So, but I think, and part of the reason I don't get too public about my actual attitudes and opinions on specific people is because I think it's really easy to go down the road of portraying the other kind of side of these beliefs in poor ways that maybe don't take them very seriously. So for one example that's relevant for today is that this work on dogmatism has forever been seen as dogmatism is bad, or the need for closure, which I didn't talk much about, but we measured it, is high need for closure is really construed as being bad. But it's like, it doesn't need to be. Like the idea that like you don't often change your mind is a bad thing. Actually, like I don't often change my mind. Like I would like to think if I got new evidence on something I would, but in terms of just like day-to-day stuff, I'm not changing my mind all the time, nobody is. Or like, I like predictable situations, that's one of the items. What's bad about that? Like, I mean, there's nothing like morally or fundamentally bad about it. And same with dogmatism, like if you like have strong beliefs that you're committed to, that's like one person's dogmatism is another person's commitment, right? Like we want that. Like when sports teams have fans that are committed, they're dogmatic. But like nobody complains about that, like except for the other team. So I try not. So you can try. So I try to. It's not. I don't think there's like such a thing as totally neutral science and totally neutral political psychology. But I also think that really injecting my own values into it is also probably not the right response either. And so I try to have some. It ends up being some wishy-washy middle ground, but that's where I'm at.
Thank you. We have one question for Bawinda. What are the main challenges you face when conducting research? Considering that ideologies in Indonesia are not absolute, they tend to be dynamic and can be said to depend on needs, based on last week's discussion.
Based on last week's discussion? What discussion?
I was not part of that.
Oh, okay. Itu pendapatnya Mario. Kayaknya semuanya, I don't know. So, what are the main challenges you can handle? Okay, so yeah, I agree that the role of ideology in Indonesia is kind of like fake. Yeah, somehow it's there, somehow it exists, but I know we cannot see it. It's kind of like ghost. It's there, we can feel it, but we cannot really, see the real impact especially in in election where people more focus on like power influence, and also maybe like participant cues thing. I think your talk gives me some idea about like maybe partisan queue is not really exist in Indonesia, but there is what we call maybe like leadership queues, and that's part of the partisan.
Yeah, so I mean,
too, right?
yeah, so it might be like instead of coming from party leaders, it might be less important than other sorts of
figures. Yeah, in our last election, our incumbent president Joko Widodo is very influential, and whatever he said, whoever he endorsed can get a lot of votes. I mean, like he never said that he endorsed someone, but he just have a dinner with one of the candidates and then have a picture together. And he said that I did nothing. I didn't support anyone. I'm neutral.
But I might disagree with him on the meaning of support, but okay. But yeah, I think, that to me that sounds like he's potentially somebody who would have a Q-like effect, and so yeah, and it might just not be less linked to specific parties, but maybe different charismatic leaders. Within the political system or something.
So yeah, maybe so it means that maybe the ideology role is minimal, but like figure role is really dominant here.
I think I'm just guessing, but like I think another possibility is that there probably is some degree of ideology in Indonesian politics. It's just that if people largely agree, it doesn't seem important. Like there is if there's like a kind of a general agreement on here, this is roughly how we should do a lot of things. That is potentially coming from some sort of shared ideological beliefs, but it's just not an argument. And because it's not an argument, it's not something that shows up a lot. Whereas like in the US where we argue about ideological stuff and we disagree about so much, then it comes out because it's obvious from how the debates go. But if even in the US, there's stuff where like both parties largely agree. You get this on foreign policy. And then actually there's less of this ideological disagreement, and it doesn't show up so much just because everybody's kind of like, oh yeah, we should do that. But that's still it still can be ideological. It's just there's not the disagreement that kind of makes it obvious.
I think that's a good explanation. I mean, like it means in other words, Marx said that we may not see the ideological role here because we have a lot of agreements on things. Right?
Potentially.
And I think I agree with you. I have some data that show that people from different parties have like roughly same support or opposing on a lot of issues. I have like 12 issues, ask them, and then they have like roughly the similar average score.
So I was reading the internet the other day, and I came across this article where they surveyed Indonesian politicians about what they thought the ideology of their parties were. And then on things like the left-right dimension, they all kind of agreed. They all kind of said they were roughly right of center. And then there's a few other stuff they asked about, then they all kind of agreed. And then the only place they got disagreement, which is consistent with what you talked about, was the religious secular stuff.
Yes.
And then everywhere else, they kind of were like, oh yeah, that's right. That's what we do. And so I think there might be something.
Yeah, that's our thought about that, Reza. Hopefully it answers your question somehow. I don't know. I hope. I mean, like, yeah, I agree that the role of ideology is wrong, but it's minimal. But it doesn't mean that it is not. It's not there. It is there still, but just minimal. Does that answer your question, Reza? I'm sorry, I cannot.
Sounds like grounds for a longer discussion next time.
Yeah, we need to do more research to answer this question actually.
Okay, let's move on to the next question then. I'm assuming this question is for both of you. Why do you think people vote differently at presidential elections and the legislative elections? Do you think it's because of their ideological differences?
Is that what happened in the US? So you are Republican but vote for Kamala. Is that possible?
It does happen. It doesn't happen. I mean, it used to happen a lot more. And then that kind of stopped. But this year seems to be potentially it might happen again a lot because there are these people who have different feelings with the presidential candidates compared to their more local candidates. But actually what's interesting is, so at least this is the polling data, but like in the state that I live in, it's really close at the presidential level, but at the state senator level, which is kind of like 1 degree more specific, the Democrat is doing great. And it's not close at all. And nobody really knows why. And so part of it could just be some polling error, and we'll find out in a month whether that's true or not. But there seems like there is some sort of realigning that is maybe taking place here, but I don't have any good insight on what exactly is happening.
Yeah, I think it's quite different to what happened here in Indonesia, where people possibly choose a party that not support your president, the president you fought for. So I mean, like, for example, the president may be supported by many parties except for, I don't know, what party not support, P3 or PDIP or PKS maybe. But they vote for the president, probably. So I mean, like, that discrepancy might happen. Yeah, maybe one possible reason is because people don't have a strong partisanship in Indonesia. I think it has been studied quite a long time ago by political scientists. I'm not an expert to explain about this actually, but I have read some papers which show that partisanship in Indonesia is pretty low or weak. So that's why people rarely use their party choice in deciding which presidential candidate they want to vote. So that's what possible reason to explain the discrepancy, I think. Fadila. Thank you for the question anyway.
I'll just like translate that, not all of it. Jadi intinya kalau konteksnya di Indonesia dan Amerika tuh agak berbeda. Menurut Dr. Brand, kalau di Amerika untuk cycle pemilu yang akan mendatang ini ada kemungkinan tinggi bahwa orang-orang pilihan presidennya itu berbeda dari pilihan legislatifnya. Mungkin karena mereka lebih gimana ya, kayak mereka mungkin mereka senang sama calon presidennya, tetapi mereka mungkin nggak begitu senang sama kayak calon perwakilan lokalnya, jadi tergantung juga sih. Tapi kalau di Indonesia, tadi seperti yang Mbak Winda bilang, partisan QC itu tidak sekuat itu dibandingkan dengan Amerika, jadi orang milih calon presiden itu mungkin sesuai dengan pasti
Ya figurnya.
iya itu sesuai figurnya atau partai politiknya, jadi yang kayak di matching aja gitu. At least that's what I do. So I assume that other people would probably do that too. Ya. Apakah ada pertanyaan lagi? Ada satu. Sama-sama. Oke. Di sini ada yang mau bertanya lagi?
Yeah, I have one question.
Okay, go ahead.
Regarding the US election, currently, I'm seeing a lot of videos, propaganda videos, that was created by the help of AI deepfake videos regarding the rise of Kamala and Donald Trump. So, how you can see these propaganda videos that are circulating in Excel, and how the policy that US regarding to take, how they have taken it.
Yeah, so we're actually, I don't have a good answer for you, but we did a survey recently of US politicians, local politicians, and actually a research assistant is coding them, not as we speak, because actually I hope they're asleep right now, but they're working on this. And we asked these local politicians what their concerns are with AI and related stuff. And so we'll see what we find from there. But one concern has been that that we've seen in other kind of work on this. This is like a different project than I showed today, but like one thing we've seen is that politicians are really concerned, like on the internet, on social media, whether the people they're interacting with are real. And so it's an interesting thing, because social media for a long time was this nice way where you could actually have direct access to your politician, and you could communicate with them. They might not communicate back with you or whatever, but like you could communicate with them. And now, and the politicians or whoever was running their social media site also were like, yes, these are real people who are making these claims and just talking with me. And now nobody knows if they're real people or if they're AI. And so it's really like, I think, muddied the water or like made it unclear whether the feedback that you get via social media has any like resemblance to the truth or not, or if it's just or what people are thinking. And so I think that's like really too bad, because I think it's essentially poisoned this potentially nice thing about social media, and I don't think there's any coming back from it either. So like I think that's just over now. But we'll see what they say about this other AI stuff, because when we first started asking people about this just actually in the spring. I have a colleague who's been doing face-to-face qualitative interviews with politicians, and she's been asking them about this, and they don't have a lot to say. But since then, there's been these videos that you've talked about. That's all really recent, and so I wonder if we went back and redid those interviews, if those politicians would have a different thing to say. But I think they're struggling to cope with it. I don't think they actually have a good idea about what's coming, which is great. Yeah.
That's intense.
Yes.
AI and politics, it can be like dangerous for elections and like democracies. So yeah, we'll see how we'll deal with that. Okay, I think we are like almost out of time. I'll like leave room for like one more question.
Of course,
Yes.
Please unmute yourself.
Hello. Okay, hold on. Let me try to get situated here. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, everyone. How's everybody doing? How are things going? Great. All right.
Great.
Am I audible? Can you hear me okay? Is my voice breaking out?
All good.
Yes, it's kind of low stability over here. Things happening. Okay, so first and foremost, I'm humbled and honored to meet you all guys online, especially Dr. Brent and Miss Winda. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lisa, and I graduated from UE from UI years ago, back in the day. Now I'm taking my doctorate degree. Actually, I almost graduated from also OE from but things took a turn and I am finishing up here at the UIN, the university, the State Islamic University of Indonesia. So lovely to meet you. And my question actually is kind of a two-parter. It goes for both of the keynote speakers. Mr. Brent, you said earlier on your concluding remarks that it depends on the psychological process, yes? Instead of the okay, let me try to break it. Let me try to go back again. You said that it really actually in a nutshell at the end it depends on the psychological processes itself, not the content, right? Not the
Yeah,
content.
I say what we find similarities in is the
Yes,
psychological
exactly.
process, but
Yes,
the content also matters. It's just not the what.
exactly. I concur. I second the opinion, and I couldn't agree more. But do you think you have narrowed down on a construct yet? Maybe have you kind of like taken a fancy on some some construct as a mental chatter like um but to be juxtaposed to be rebutted with the content as a for the construct on the similarities. And this question also goes for Mr. Dr. Winda as well. Thank you so much for having me, and back to you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand the second part of your question is
Yeah.
like you're asking like whether or not like we really have a good way of measuring and thinking about these constructs.
Mhm.
All
Are
right.
anything set in stone yet as a contract as far as contracts are concerned? Constructs. I mean, sorry, apologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't actually have like a great answer to this, so I apologize for that. But I think one of the things that we've kind of found as like a field and really has been I think much clearer in the last few years actually is that exactly how we measure ideology, for example, does seem to make a difference. And so that's why we ran those last two studies as a part to try to see if some of that mattered here. But I think we could have measured ideology in another 10 different ways, and we might have come up with slightly different conclusions. And I think that's kind of just a challenge in the field is trying to figure out the best ways to measure these things, and or even if there is no one best way, figuring out the measure that is like the most consequential for the context we're in. And so like, you know, the context that I was doing my studies in, I think those measures are consequential in the US, but maybe there's other ones that I could have used instead. I wouldn't use the liberal conservative item, for example, in Indonesia. I don't think that would make any sense here. So that wouldn't be consequential here. And so so some of it is just like well, hopefully being thoughtful about the context we're working in and choosing measures that make the most sense. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, so yeah, from my study, as I have just shown that, yeah, different measures indeed give different results. when I use like issue specific measure, which I call as attitudinal measure as a proxy for political ideology. And I found that the simultaneous approach is supported, which means that I found support for both linear and quadratic effects significant. In other words, ideological extremism and also the rigidity of the right hypothesis were supported. But when I use overall political ideology measure in the analysis, I only found the ideological extremism hypothesis was supported. So I agree with Dr. Brand that there is some measurement issues here. So different measure may give different, impact, but I'm not sure why that being the case here. I don't have any data yet to give a best answer to that. I'm sorry, Ms. Lisa.
No, apologies not needed. It's already it's been a privilege to be a part of this. So thank you for that. And I'm gonna let you get back to the thing. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for elaborating that for me. It's quite it's really it's really a really a humbling experience. And I had to do my homework first, which is to really read up all of your excerpts, excerpts which I hadn't had the chance to yet a couple hours ago. So thank you so much for that. I wish you much best of success and happiness. So back to you, sir and ma'am. Thank you so much. Have a great one, guys. Okay.
Thank you so much, Bella, for the question. And I am afraid we are out of time, you guys. So again, let's give a round of applause for. Also, follow us on Instagram at Lapsipol, that's LABPSIPOL, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to check out their papers on the Google Scholars. Just Google them. They're super established. It's very easy to find them. So I hope to see you guys again in our next research talk, which is, we don't know yet, but we'll let you know. Follow our Instagram. Okay, thank you.